Thank you for joining the Brodies webinar on investing in Scotland's natural economy as part of the journey to net zero. I'm Graeme Leith and I'm a partner in the rural business team at Brodies. Today's webinar is a panel conversation, and I am delighted to be joined by expert panellists who between them have a huge level of direct experience of carbon sequestration projects and also knowledge of the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, which underpin the financial incentives for qualifying projects. So the panelist today, firstly, is David Robertson. David heads the investment division of Scottish Woodlands. Day to day, he liaises with landowners, agents, and a variety of other partners to secure a range of forestry and land subjects on behalf of private, corporate, and institutional clients. With nearly 30 years of experience in management roles across Scotland, David applies his practical knowledge of the forest industry and the backing of a network of local managers to ensure his clients get the best results to achieve their overall objectives. Dr. Vicky West has overseen the management and development of the Woodland Carbon Code programme across the UK, and she is also an executive board member of the UK's Peatland Code and is involved in various other initiatives to ensure the credibility and functionality of the developing carbon market. She has worked around 20 years with Forestry Commission and more recently with Scottish Forestry in areas of forestry policy and climate change after completing a PhD in modelling global climate change. Our next panellist is David MacArthur. David is a director and co-owner of the carbon negative environmental consultancy, MacArthur Green. David has been involved in ecological and ornithological assessments of renewable energy projects for 20 years. He and his team have also developed their own biodiversity-rich Woodland Carbon Code project as part of MacArthur Green's own carbon negative business model. And he is heavily involved in advising landowners, developments, and Nature Scot on peatland codes and peatland action projects. Our final panellist today is Andrew Akentewe, who is a partner in the corporate and commercial department at Brodies. Andrew advises a diverse client base of corporates, investment managers, and banks on corporate transactions and the formation and operation of investment fund structures. He has advised investment managers on structuring funds and raising capital for investment into forestry, renewable energy, and other sustainable assets. And I'm your host today. I'm Graeme Leith. I'm a partner on the rural business team at Brodies, and I regularly advise clients on the acquisition, management, and disposal of forests and land for tree planting, including advice on the Woodland Carbon Code. So thanks again for joining us. I'd like to start off what question for you, Vicky. Now, the number of qualifying projects under the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code have significantly increased over the past 12 to 18 months. And these codes are now key to helping us achieve net zero. To put this in context, Vicky, could you please just summarise for the audience what we need to know about the purpose of these codes and how they are operating in practice?
Sure, thanks, Graeme. So the Woodland Carbon Code is a UK-wide voluntary standard which allows the generation of carbon units from woodland creation projects. That means that landowners can generate carbon units that they could either use themselves or which they could sell to corporates who are looking to meet net zero targets or to offset their emissions. In order to be eligible, your woodland needs to be well managed and meet the UK forestry standard. And you also need to show that you need the carbon finance to make the project go ahead. So it wouldn't happen without that carbon funding. This is what we call additionality. In terms of how the carbon code works, Scottish Forestry manage the standard across the UK, the standard and the infrastructure to make the market function. The standard itself is endorsed by ICROA, an international body for carbon offsetting. It's mentioned as a quality standard in PAS 2060. That's British Standards Institute standard for carbon neutrality. And it's also mentioned as a quality standard in the UK government's environmental reporting guidelines. As well as that, the standard has various things to support the market. One of those is a transparent public registry called the UK Land Carbon Registry. And that allows us to track projects, issuances of units, the ownership of units, and then the use of those credits as they are used by people against their emissions. Another thing supporting the standard is that's really important for the voluntary market is to have independent validation and verification of projects. So our projects have to be checked at the outset. That's called validation, and then checked every 10 years. That's verification to confirm how much carbon has been sequestered. That process is undertaken by either soil association or organic farmers and growers. Supporting the standard is also robust science to know how much carbon is sequestered in the trees. We have models and protocols to help predict and measure carbon sequestration, and the majority of the work is through forest research with other experts from across the UK. We also have in place strategies to deal with permanence and leakage, which are two other things important in carbon standards. You also have to remember that woodlands take a long time to grow. So planting a tree doesn't instantly give you sequestered carbon. It can take up to 100 years for the woodland to establish. And so we issue two types of unit. Up front, we issue what we call pending issuance units. They're like a promise to deliver carbon in future. And it's important for all parties to remember that these are not guaranteed. But it can help a company plan with that, plan for net zero in terms of buying carbon units in advance that are likely to be delivered within the time period where they want to be net zero. Once projects are verified, units are converted to woodland carbon units, and these are confirmed as sequestered carbon. These are guaranteed. And they can be used then as an offset against your current year's emissions. As Graeme said, we've had a massive increase in interest in the last 12 months, 18 months, both from the landowner end of things, as well as from those interested in purchasing credits. The number of projects doubled within the last financial year, and it's doubled again within the last 6 months. So there's now 1,200 projects across the UK covering about 45,000 hectares. And those projects already registered with us are predicted to sequester about 15 million tonnes of CO2 over the next 100 years. From a buyer perspective, buyers are quite often interested in the wider benefits of a project. It's not just about the tonne of carbon. So we have a woodland benefits tool that helps people understand the relative benefits of each project in terms of the biodiversity, the water elements, community and economy. As well for landowners, it's useful to remember there are other benefits for creating woodland in terms of providing shelter for your stock and healthier stock within your farm. Fencing out areas with woodland might make the rest of your farm easier to manage. And also they might provide wood fuel for heating, which would be useful in a time where oil and gas prices are increasing, and wood fuel would be a more sustainable option, and helps you to diversify your income streams. In terms of the sales of units so far, 60 or 70% of the units that we've validated have already been purchased up front as PIUs. That's about 3 million units. And buyers range from oil companies, distilleries in Scotland, retail, packaging, supermarkets. Plus, there's an increasing number of landowners who are growing their own carbon units, and you'll hear a bit more about that later. There's around 1.5 million pending issuance units available for sale at the moment. And there's a wider number of projects registered, and talking to the project developers and landowners with those registered projects might allow you to access projects that are in the pipeline. Just two other things quickly. If you're a landowner looking to apply and create a carbon woodland, the key thing is that you need to check you're eligible and you need to register before you start planting. You can do that directly as a landowner, or you can use an agent, a land agent such as Scottish Woodlands, to help you do that. If you're a buyer and you are looking to buy units, then on the Woodland Carbon Code website, there is a buy carbon page. You can find all the project developers that have units available for sale. So at the moment, most purchases are done on an over-the-counter basis. So it's a negotiation between the landowner or project developer and the buyer. That's probably all I'll say for now as an introduction, Graeme, and I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Vicky. David Robertson, Scottish Woodlands are obviously involved in many tree planting projects, and you know, as Vicky's mentioned, as we've all seen, the rate of tree planting has recently you know, increased. Is it your experience that it's these carbon sequestration opportunities that are driving the new planting? And are you also seeing any change to the demographic of investors compared to, you know, the type of individuals or entities that have historically invested in woodland property?
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. And yeah, absolutely. And mirroring what Vicky said, you know, there's a clear uplift in interest across the board. As an example, 2018 and 2019, Scottish Woodlands assisted in the purchase of around about 3,000 hectares per annum between forestry and agricultural land for planting. This year, that figure is likely to be closer to 25,000 hectares. So we're seeing a significant uplift in intake, a significant uplift in interest. Tree planting in Scotland's risen from 2,700 hectares in 2010 to over 10,500 hectares last year. And practically everybody that we speak to in that regard has carbon as a main focus, as a main consideration. Farmers and landowners are looking at it for biodiversity and habitat improvement, you know, as part of their overall land unit, diversification, shelter being important to them, things like simplification of field systems to benefit stock management and streamlining through the removal of problematic areas where, you know, they might have had stock management issues in the past, or areas of the farms which have reverted to poor quality through drainage issues, and simply the economics of agriculture at the current time, reverting these back to any agricultural production is really, really difficult. In wider landowning estates, changing land use through to aspects such as attitude to unproductive grouse moors is a major driver. You know, perhaps even changes in family outlooks on sporting activity, just the way that families are reassessing the management of their overall assets at the current time, landowning families. Yeah. I think customer demand and expectation is a constant focus for investors and landowners, and aspects like whole farm carbon audits are really important. Being reviewed by, you know, being reviewed by supermarkets, for instance, in relation to the expectations of farm carbon balances are major drivers. And you know, for instance, my brother-in-law, who's let's say an avid agriculturalist, phoned me last week asking how he might be able to convert a small part of the farm that they own into a woodland resource to look at offsetting carbon, the residual carbon that they can't look at offsetting through other means. So, you know, I think people are looking at this in a much wider way. I think SMEs, larger corporates and institutional investors are looking clearly to address unavoidable emissions as part of carbon reduction and offset plans. They're looking at aspects like value-based leadership. they're leading from the front. It not only gives them tangible benefits, but it also gives them a feel-good factor for their own staff and for customers. They're looking at ESG and ecosystem services such as biodiversity, air, water quality, flood management, wider economic benefits and community benefits that Vicky mentioned. And I think very importantly, they're also looking at business resilience as well. So their investment in forestry not only has an impact on physical climate change, and they can demonstrate that through the Woodland Carbon Code process, but it also prepares these businesses for changes in expectation and from customer focus as well. Customers demanding more from companies that they're buying services and goods from. And I think as well in business resilience, expectations of compulsory carbon compliance expected to come in the future. That's a major driver for businesses buying and looking to invest in carbon at the current time. It allows them to set their own carbon pricing structure rather than buying carbon from the market at some point in the future. And I think finally on that point, most of the investors and most of the landowners and farmers that we see converting land at the current time certainly share our view that timber demand in the UK is set to exceed supply for the foreseeable future. And there is an incremental value increase, which is attributed to that. So, they're also keeping an eye to the economic drivers in that aspect as well.
Sure. Okay. And Andrew, what's your view on the investment funds that we've seen, perhaps over the past 10 years, much more active players in the forestry investment market? How are they responding to the carbon sequestration opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. I mean, forestry generally has been established as a fairly specialist asset class for many years, as you suggest. And we've been involved since around 2007 in helping investment managers who focus on forestry as an asset class in designing investment funds that invest in forestry assets and raising capital. Approximately 800 million of capital, I think, has been raised through those investment funds for investment into forestry. So historically, most of that will have been commercial forestry. And over the past few years, there has been more focus on forest carbon and in designing investment funds that generate returns from the sale of woodland carbon units registered through the Woodland Carbon Code. And there is increasing institutional demand for these products, and that is clear as pension funds and other institutional investors continue to shape their ESG policies and seek to invest in low carbon investments. There have historically been a range of investors, not just institutions like pension funds, also through an investment fund, which is a diversified investment, a pooled investment. It is possible for other sort of high net worth, sophisticated investors to make an investment in a fund that invests in forestry assets. But the forest carbon focus is relatively recent, and as the market develops and becomes more liquid, it's likely to continue to attract a range of investors.
Okay, thank you. David, MacArthur Green have got direct experience of their own carbon sequestration projects. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so just to give you some background to why we invested in our own Woodland Carbon Code project and how we've gone about this. So the climate and biodiversity emergencies are the key drivers behind our decision to transition to a carbon negative business, and to do this in a way that promotes biodiversity, so really focused on that end of things. Also, as an environmental consultancy, we felt that it was really important for us to rise to the challenge and so show leadership in this area, and hopefully demonstrate to other businesses how this can be achieved and how this approach can be adapted and be successful by others too. So we feel that this is the right thing to do do anyway. But from a business perspective, we consider it to be a very wise, sensible investment, given the degree to which our clients are starting to value carbon reduction as part of their procurement processes and as part of their wider supply chain. So I really do feel that the direction of travel with this is very, very clear. And I think if businesses don't start adapting more to this and incorporating this in the way they do business, carbon reduction, they will be at a disadvantage in the medium to long term. So it was a very, from a business perspective, it was a very sensible investment for us, not just the right thing to do. So our approach was and is to measure our carbon footprint annually, keep on implementing our carbon reduction plan. There's a lot of work to do there every year to try and keep the emissions going down. But also, and what we're talking about today, was a big part of our approach was to develop our own biodiversity-rich woodland carbon code scheme as part of our nature-based offset plan. So to take you through our woodland project, what it involved, I have a plan of the site so that I can explain our approach in a little bit more detail. So that should pop up. Here it is. I should mention firstly that we wanted to actually purchase the area of land to do this rather than have for example, a lease arrangement with a landowner, so that we could have the freedom to manage it in the way that we felt was best and to have a greater degree of permanence over the area. And we also gained a woodland grant, an establishment grant from Forestry Scotland. So to work out how best to optimise the biodiversity at this site, we completed our own ecological surveys of the area. Now, some of you that are listening in may not be that familiar with this area. You'll see that there's an inset there which gives a bit better idea of the location. It's in the west of Scotland in Argyll. Not Inveraray is to the north of the site. This is the village of Lochair. Here, the village of Lochilp, it's just further down to the south. So it's an hour and a half, or 2 hours from Glasgow, depending if the rest, and be thankful, is shut by a landslide. So that's the location. The site's about, overall, it's around 40 hectares or so in size. So we completed our own ecological surveys of the area to work out how best to manage a site and where to plant the trees. So we use this information to determine the best location for the woodland, the best type of trees for the site, but also to define the other management objectives for the area in terms of biodiversity, archaeological interests, and also we were keen as part of this to have a wider social impact of the scheme. And I'll get onto that in a wee second. So looking at the biodiversity, actually looking at the woodland first. So because we wanted to take the approach of maximising biodiversity, the woodland that we wanted to plant was a native woodland, specific for this area of Argyll. So what you can see here on the plan, the light green area, Management Unit A, this is all existing woodland on the site, and it's mostly ancient oak woodland. And you can see it's very fragmented, and that's as a consequence probably of centuries of grazing on the ground and it being cut back for wood fueling and so on over the last millennia probably. So our focus here with the woodland was to attach these isolated islands, join them up to make a much more resilient and stable woodland site that will be biodiversity rich in the future. When you have small isolated islands of ancient woodland, they don't have the area to maintain the specific microclimate that a lot of the species need in terms of the moisture to support rare liverworts and lichens. So by making this woodland a larger area, it will increase its biodiversity and its resilience to future climate change. Now, just to look at the woodland that we are planting, you can see this, we've split them into two areas, this management unit B1 and B2. So B1 is this purple area, which is what I've called dry woodland very broadly. And the dry woodland is largely species which prefer drier ground, and it's species such as oak and hazel, silver birch, some areas of Scots pine, some areas of aspen as well. And then in the area which I have called wet woodland, the brown area, that's areas which slightly wetter ground, a bit more inundated, and we've planted species which prefer these conditions, so alder, willow and birch, largely within these areas. Now, not all of the site was suitable for woodland. It wouldn't have been appropriate to plant the whole area. We have this blue area in the middle is an area of blanket mire, which is obviously a very important carbon sink in itself. And this area was identified by the NVC surveys of the area and also the peat depth surveys that a lot of woodland schemes have to now do unless they're known to be in brown earth, I guess. So this area, it's not degraded to the extent that it would qualify for a peatland code or peatland action grant, but it is degraded in that there are areas of rhododendron and self-seeding Sitka spruce growing in it. So we're removing that to enhance and maintain this area of mire in the longer term. There's a lot of areas in the open ground. You'll see the yellow. There's a lot of areas that aren't planted, and that's over and above the minimum open ground requirement. And that's because there's really important flush groundwater dependent habitats in that area that we know, for example, that we have marsh fritillary butterfly in. We just discovered that this year, so we'll be actively managing that to maintain their interests. It's a very rare butterfly, Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act and a European protected species. So we're managing the ground for that as well, and that was a nice surprise this year to find the larval webs. So there are other interests apart from biodiversity in the site. We have important archaeology. We have chambered cairns in the area. You can see them as the red and blue dots here. So their Neolithic cairns are over 2,000 years old. And we have cup and ring marks on the site as well. So we obviously made sure that we buffered these areas and we'll stop them being overgrown by bracken and weeds and so on. So the final thing to mention with this, the way we've approached this site, is you can see there's a pedestrian track, a space for that track left through the middle of the site. So that's been designed in to the woodlands. So we are working with the local community at Lochair, the Lochair Association, to seek funding to establish this path to attach the Lochair community to the East Kames community here. And that path it won't just start there, it will probably, MacArthur will own this land as well here. So it will find its way to a track and join up with these communities. So that's the site. Just talk through there. We can probably lose the figure now. I should say that all these measures it's important. We obviously have an operational plan for the site, which is part of the woodland project, but that doesn't cover all the wider management that we're doing. So we've included all these measures in our natural and historic heritage management plan for the site, and you can find that on our website if you're interested in looking into it a bit more. A final point that I'll make here is that even though we're not planning to sell the woodland carbon units here, we're planning to use them for our own business. I think it's for anyone that's embarking on these projects where there are opportunities to enhance biodiversity. I think it's very important to do that, not just as it's the right thing to do, but I think there really is value in doing it. And as long as that has been captured properly as part of a management plan and that value can be communicated as part of the wider package, I think buyers, we may come on to this, buyers will be valuing that as part of the type of woodland carbon unit that is for sale. Yeah, that covers my involvement in the project. So.
Thanks, David. That was very interesting and to time as well, which is great. There's obviously carbon sequestration is a key, obviously playing a greater role in delivering this, but for several years there's been a huge push by the Scottish Government to increase tree coverage, and I think as all of the panellists know, that can only be achieved through a variety of different types and scales of schemes. So we've got our large conifer dominant schemes, we've got the native woodland and peatland restoration schemes of the type that MacArthur Green have done at Loch Gair. I think farm level schemes, shelter belt and small plantations within working farms have got a part to play within that as well. Obviously, we've got the carbon income potential. We've got quite generous grants for a lot of this planting and establishment work as well. But the impression I get is that we're still falling short of these targets. Even with all of these incentives and drivers. I think the climate change target is 30,000 hectares per annum in Scotland, I believe. But I'm aware that even at the current level of planting, the industry is facing criticism from some quarters in terms of the scale of planting, and certainly in certain parts of South Scotland in particular. There's suggestion that they're removing productive agricultural land from food production, and also the term that we're hearing more about recently is the green laird, and suggestions that the industry is facilitating the growth of these green lairds, people who are apparently just looking to get what they can from the credits that are available. David Robertson, how would you respond to those criticisms, and do you see a way of us actually getting to these targets despite these challenges?
Yeah, thanks again, Graeme. Yeah, it's an uphill struggle, and one thing to clarify is that the 30,000 hectare target is a UK target, not a Scottish target. It's fair to say that Scotland is just purely because of our landform and what we have is likely to bear the brunt of that planting target and that planting aspiration. Scotland's doing 80% of the planting in the UK at the current time, and that's more to do with the very strong support that the Scottish Government gives forestry and the joined up thinking between the government agencies in Scotland as opposed to England and Wales and Northern Ireland, where I think it's fair to say that government agencies are still working somewhat in silos, looking at their own interests rather than overall goals. I think it's fair to say there's definitely a tension in land use, absolutely. Aspects like the current additionality rules, regulations in cultivation, etc., are definitely forcing planting down the hill. They're definitely forcing us onto and forestry investors and people who own and manage land to plant land which is a better quality than they previously would have done under other regulations. But it's fair to say that we've got over 5 million hectares of agriculture in Scotland, and over 4.5 million hectares of that's grazing land. So there's more than enough land to go around, in my opinion. I think the inevitable reductions in agricultural support are likely to make already marginal farms even more borderline in their economic status, and forestry can certainly plug some of those gaps and provide an alternative land use, which is making the most of the land use resource that we have in Scotland as a national asset as such. And to give that a little bit of context, that the government strategy is to increase woodland cover in Scotland from 18% in 2019 to 21% by 2032. In simple terms, according to my maths, that's a 3% uplift in change. And of course, that's going to come out of farming. So it's a 3% loss of farming, a 3% gain to woodland overall. The further ambition goals that the UK government have look very much as if they would raise that land use change from around about 3% under the Scottish aims up to somewhere between 5 and 7% of land up to 2050. So we are looking at something which is a sub 10% change in agricultural versus forestry in a switch. Again, I think it's also fair to say that is going to be focused in specific areas. You know, when we say that we have 4.5 million hectares of grazing land in Scotland, a lot of that is upland grazing land, which is not necessarily suitable for either for productive afforestation or indeed for native woodland planting and ecological habitat type natural capital schemes. But the drivers are in the right place. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier on, when I talked about the different types of landowner interventions and the investors as well, I feel the differing sectors are actually carrying out the ones that are carrying out planting are doing so for very good reason. You know, they're helping the UK PLC to meet UK PLC's overall net zero targets. They're also looking at diversification within land use. They're looking at diversification of agriculture for very good business purposes and very good business reasons. So I find it quite hard to accept or to criticise investors of any type for helping UK PLC to meet these goals. Now, others on the panel may disagree with that. It would be interesting to hear, but you know, these are being met. A lot of these decisions are being made to meet overall aims for net zero and you know, commercial and capital incentives that are there and present from the government.
Okay, and David MacArthur, how do you think that current policy sits with the principles of biodiversity, which is obviously a key focus of your business? Yeah,
I mean, I completely understand that, you know, commercial forestry does have very important social and economic benefits, and there's a real need there to promote that and increase our supply of commercial forest. I think what's important is making sure that these newer commercial forests, I think this is the case, do incorporate biodiversity objectives, and it's done so in a sensible way. For example, creating corridors of native woodland through sites and trying to use these corridors to join up isolated islands throughout the wider countryside, and taking that more of a landscape approach to the design would be a very sensible way to go about things. I think a kind of feeling with the way biodiversity is valued, I think, you know, what we've actually achieved here, what has been achieved here with the voluntary market for carbon is, you know, we've created a market for an ecosystem service which was never there before, the ecosystem service of carbon sequestration. Now, there's obviously loads of other ecosystem services which we haven't managed to do that for. One of them is biodiversity, which is one of the most fundamental, one of them all. The way that we can do that is we have the tools, we have you know, that have come out of the biodiversity net gain, which is coming out in England through the Environment Bill very, very soon, and it will be a requirement of NPF 4 to measure biodiversity gain on a site. So there are techniques there that can quantify biodiversity at a site and work out how it's improved or otherwise by a project. So if you take our project at Akentewe, for example, biodiversity will be increased there by our woodland. I think what we want to try and do in a structured and organised way is to allow these projects to communicate the actual tangible biodiversity benefits that they are having. And in that way, if they're quantified properly, they can be valued properly in the sale process of the carbon units. So I do think the tools are there to do it now, the tools that go along with biodiversity net gain. that have been developed by DEFRA. And I think it's really, maybe this is the next stage. We can get onto this, maybe more of a discussion at the end, in that, you know, how do we actually start incorporating that into projects so the value can be recognised in the price. So I think these kind of projects are still at a disadvantage. They're doing better now because of the Woodland Carbon Code, but I think there's value in them that's not being recognised fully because it's not being quantified, and I think that can probably change.
Okay. I mean, if we could maybe turn now to the market for the woodland carbon units and the peatland units as well. And looking at this from an investor point of view, Vicky, you perhaps have the greatest visibility on who's actually acquiring these units for their voluntary reporting, rather than perhaps as David explained earlier, that, you know, a number of corporates are investing in the projects themselves, but there's obviously the system allows for the units to be sold. Are you seeing a lot of demand? Is there sufficient supply there into the market?
Certainly there is massively increased demand in the last year. We have to be realistic with those who are looking to buy as well. Quite a lot of people are coming looking to buy verified woodland carbon units to offset their emissions now, and we have to be clear that that's not possible because the woodlands are just so young. So what is available is pending issuance units. So if you have a strategy to be net zero by 2050, say, you could purchase pending issuance units that will be delivered within that period. And I think I said previously, there's around 3 million of the units have been sold already up front. There's around 1.5 million pending issuance units for sale. So there's, yes, definitely increasing demand. The number of projects has increased rapidly in the last 12 months as well. It's just trying to keep a balance between the two that's a challenge at the moment, and keeping them in sync.
Yeah. And I think as a few of you have touched on, there's quite a lot of inconsistency in terms of the prices being asked for and paid for these units. It's been my recent experience that there's also quite a variation in terms of the contractual protection that's available for investors as well. I mean, we're talking about very long-term projects here that are targeted on land where, you know, ownership may well change several times during the period of the project. So, you know, I think there's a lot that is still being worked out in terms of how the market is going to operate. So in that sense, it's maybe quite immature. You know, some investors might be a bit nervous about that. Are there steps that you can see that are being taken or can be taken to try and help the market just develop and maybe scale up as well?
Sure, yeah, and globally for the voluntary carbon market, this is an issue where the market needs to develop and become more mature. And there's a couple of global initiatives that are kind of helping with that. So there's a task force for scaling the voluntary carbon market, which is looking at a number of issues and making recommendations about how the market needs to develop. And there's also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which is slightly more from the buyer end focused, but also looking at how the market needs to develop to protect the integrity. As you said, with pricing, we don't have a formal mechanism to price carbon units at the moment in the UK, but some companies do already produce a carbon price index or spot prices for carbon units in other voluntary markets globally, and we're looking at how they can help us do that for the UK as well, so that we'd have more transparent carbon price, potentially with a if we could manage it like a 30-day rolling average price, so that you could see what's happening more instantly and more transparently. We're also looking at there's a number of companies looking at the carbon contract and how we can improve the carbon contract, with the potential to have a sort of template or model terms that need to be included. I've also talked to a number of insurance companies that are looking at providing insurance for the carbon market. We're looking at how we can improve the monitoring of projects and make it more efficient, and use new technology as it comes along, as well as just the whole workflow of the program to make it more efficient. Globally, there's an initiative to kind of link all the carbon registries globally, so that it's much more transparent, all the carbon units that are available globally, but also to allow links between registries, links with trading platforms and sales platforms, so that the sale can be automated and more transparent too, which will help with pricing as well. And equally, in terms of providing protection, there's a couple of things we need to do a bit more work on. One is kind of understanding that the PIU market is a futures market, and we need to make sure that that is well regulated as it develops, so that everybody understands the liabilities when things are being sold on, and potentially looking at what added protection there is for the buyer in terms of potentially having a covenant or other stuff in place to ensure that the project is protected at the landowner end. So that's just a few of the things that we're looking at in terms of helping the market develop from where it is to be a more well-rounded and mature kind of marketplace.
Yeah, and Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I know you've had some experience of other jurisdictions and what they do in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, Vicky's very comprehensively summarized the initiatives that are intended to help develop a more liquid and efficiently priced market in the UK. We have some experience of forest carbon projects in other jurisdictions, including, for example, New Zealand, where forest carbon units are traded in the New Zealand emissions trading scheme. And it will be interesting to see if the UK forest carbon market develops in a comparable way. Certainly that, together with the other initiatives that Vicky has mentioned, one assumes would help create a more liquid and efficiently priced market. The other aspect of liquidity, of course, just the ability of buyers of units to trade them on. And at the moment, that can be difficult for certain types of buyers who aren't sort of financial buyers effectively, to sort of trade their units in the secondary market. And those kinds of the ability to do that more easily will also help the development of a more liquid market.
Okay, I'm conscious that we've been talking a lot about trees and tree planting, but of course there are other carbon sequestration opportunities, not really as perhaps as well developed in terms of the funding models as the Woodland Carbon Code. But David MacArthur, you spoke earlier about the role that peatland restoration played at Loch Gare. I mean, is that a growth area, or is there more that we could be doing in relation to peatland, do you think?
Well, it's definitely a growth area. So the peatland code was added to UK carbon registry just at the end of last year. And already, I don't have the numbers to hand, Vicky, I'm sure probably will, the number of projects is increasing very quickly. But, with the peatland code, we have, Nature Scot offering the Peatland Action Grant. And it's not just Nature Scot, it's also the National Park Authorities, and I think Forestry Scotland, I think, are also administering or enacting the funds as well on their ground. so they've got very high targets for the restoration of peatland, and they are running behind on projects and where they're hoping to be. But we are seeing certainly a lot of projects now coming forward and being evaluated under the peatland code or peatland action. So the interest is most definitely there. And I guess we'll start to see these projects make their way through the validation process in the near future.
Okay. And David Robertson, I mean, I'm aware that historically peat has been an area to avoid when we were talking about some of the larger plantations. Are you seeing practices developing there to have more of a sort of holistic approach to peatland and large scale planting?
Yeah, certainly, Graeme. And as you say, when we purchased land previously for afforestation projects, peatland was always an issue. And more often than not, buying upland sites, 25, 30, 40% of the site can be peatland, and that was almost not considered in the investment appraisals that we did at that stage. But very much now it is. 20% of Scotland is peat, and 80% of that peat is degraded in some way, and there are huge moves afoot to try and restore that. As David said, in the recent programme for government, the Scottish Government reinforced their commitment of 250 million over the period to 2030 to restore 250,000 hectares of peatland. So that is definitely attracting existing landowners and potential investors to look at peatland restoration sites. I do think it's important that these sites are looked at in a rounded way. I think investors coming in to buy a remote peatland on its own to restore it and to claim carbon credits is somewhat of a risky business. There has to be an overall property management, landscape scale property sort of analysis done, before one's looking at peatland restoration on these types of sites. Is my current view.
Okay,
but it's definitely very much of interest to new investors and existing landowners. Great.
I'm conscious that we've got about 5 minutes left. We're getting quite a few questions and comments coming through. Now, a few of these actually relate to this point about the level of carbon that is being or can be sequestered from the projects that are ongoing or in the pipeline. And Vicky, I think you mentioned 15 million tonnes over 100 years. Now, a lot of the audience are quite keen to understand that figure in context. What contribution is that going to make, or can that make, to the net zero targets?
Sure. So I just had a quick Google while we were on. The UK's current emissions, or the UK's emissions for 2020, which will have been slightly low because of COVID, were 326 million tonnes of CO2 in 1 year. So the projects we've got so far are not having a massive impact on that. I guess one thing that is clear is we can't plant our way out of this problem. There isn't enough land in the UK. So we do need to drastically reduce our emissions first before we look at woodland creation, peatland restoration, although they're both equally important. There was a study done a few years ago where they said if we could plant at 30,000 hectares a year for the next few years, and we reduced our emissions in line with the emissions reduction target, then woodlands would be the sequestration in woodlands would offset at least 10% of the UK's emissions every year.
Right. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to answer any or many more of the questions, but thanks everyone who's put these questions in the panels, and we will get back to you separately on those. Just before we finish up, you know, and obviously we're COP26 is on us, so just keen for thoughts probably from both of the Davids. What would you each like to see in terms of government policy or market developments for us to make some meaningful progress towards net zero? So quick answers from each of you, if that's okay.
I'll go first on a very quick answer. I think clear outcomes on the financial test for carbon additionality, which Woodland Carbon Code are working on at the current time. You know, this is a you know, a potential major. Well, Woodland Carbon Code is a major stimulant for investors coming into woodland creation. It's also a major stimulant for existing landowners, and you know, any uncertainty in the additionality questions for the Woodland Carbon Code are major blockers and are already starting to put people off the potential of investment. So that needs to be focused on very clearly. Transparency in the sale of carbon units, again, we've talked about quite widely today. Also, HMRC tax status of carbon units, which is something which is very much up in the air. We need clear guidance from HMRC in regard to the treatment of carbon units going forward.
Excellent. Well, that's 3, David, and in a minute. So thank you for making the brief. David MacArthur, have you got anything you'd like to mention?
A couple of very quick points. We run out of time. The first one I kind of alluded to earlier was I do think woodland planting is a great way of tackling the two crises that we have, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. I think it's important, though, that we have the mechanisms there to quantify biodiversity benefit now by using the biodiversity net gain method and assessing biodiversity units. I think that could easily be incorporated into further schemes, whether it's a bit of research, forest research too, and it can be used to for individual sites. So I think that's something that would be very important to try and build on in the future to encourage more biodiversity rich projects and let landowners receive value from that through the carbon units. The other one, I see some of the questions popping up about renewable energy developers wanting to do more. The issue with that at the moment, I raised it in a talk I did for Scottish Renewables earlier on in the year, is with additionality. It's not clear, there's no guidance at the moment on where your compensation or mitigation ends and your enhancement starts. So it's very difficult to demonstrate additionality. And this is something that, you know, I picked up with Nature Scott. I think there's rumblings of discussions about how this can be achieved. I think if that is achieved, it could actually really scale up a lot of the peatland restoration projects in particular. I think there's a win-win for renewable developers and landowners in that area. And it could also benefit woodland creation schemes as well, of course.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Well, that's us out of time, I'm afraid. So all I would like to do is to thank all of our panelists today. I think there's some really interesting points, and I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there as well. I hope everyone who was able to join us today got something from that, and thanks for your own time, and we will get back to you in relation to your questions. Thank you very much.
Graeme, bye now, bye-bye.